Hello and welcome to A-Team Group's webinar on FRTB implementation in APAC, an industry update and a discussion on what is left to do. My name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at A-Team Group and I will be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Dr. Xiao Xiao, Head of Derivatives and Regulation APAC at ICE Data Service, Fausto Marsaglia, Head of Product Management, FRTB and Regulatory at Refinitiv and LSEG Business, Gail Robert, Head of Global Risk Analytics at Mitsui, and Vishal Kapoor, Sector Team Lead and IBG Business Lead, Group Research Executive Director at DBS Bank. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a moment, but just wanted to let you know how best to use our webinar today. To the right of your screen, you'll see a Slido panel. There are two sections to that. There are poll questions. We'll be running 3 poll questions today, so please do get involved and tell us what you're thinking about certain aspects of FRTB. And there's also a panel there for your questions. Please put your questions for the speakers in that panel and put them in as often as you like. You can start early, whatever, and we'll answer as many as we can as we go along through the webinar. So thank you. I hope you enjoy it. And enough of me. Let me ask our speakers to introduce themselves. So Xiao, let's come to you first, please.
Thank you. So good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Xiao Xiao. I'm from ICE Data Services. I lead the derivatives and regulation business in Asia Pacific region. I'm based out in Hong Kong. I'm responsible for the product strategy and business development for the derivatives, data analytics, and the regulatory solution across all asset classes. I'm very excited to be here today.
Thank you. Over to you, Fausto.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And my name is Fausto Marsaglia, and I'm leading the overall business and product management for a number of regulatory propositions, which include FRTB at global level. Thank you.
Thank you. Gail, please introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. My name is Gail. I lead a small team in charge of the risk model. So we develop, maintain, and check risk model around market risk and counterparty credit risk, and this includes especially the FRTB. So I've been lucky enough to be involved in the FRTB design and at Basel level, and then ultimately the implementation of the FRTB since 2019.
Great expertise there. Looking forward to hearing about that. Okay, Vishal.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vishal Kapoor. I'm basically the sector lead and also the IBG business lead for research. So as part of our research, we definitely look at all the regulations and how these regulations might impact the banks. As per my previous background, I have been in audit and risk, so that's also my natural affinity towards FRTB.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all. So let's get started with an audience poll, which you'll be able to see to the right of your video screen. It is how much progress has your organization made in the implementation of FRTB? So while you answer that question, let me come to Xiao to set the scene and tell us a little bit about the state of play on FRTB implementation across APAC.
Sure. Maybe let's start with some jurisdiction regulatory timeline across APAC. So, for example, in Hong Kong, the Monetary Authority of Hong Kong has conducted a consultation on proposed amendment to the market risk capital charge late last year. And the amendments are expected to be introduced into legislation, and the reporting under the new rule will only start from January 1st, 2024. Well, Korea has pretty much gone live with the FRTB from the beginning of this year. While we're moving down south, Australia banks are waiting for APRA to finalize both FRTB and the CVA risk framework with the expected timeline of 2026.
Okay, that leaves us with some gaps and differences. Vishal, how are you seeing it out there? What's it looking like?
Yeah, so Singapore has also already started. So Singapore was scheduled to go live this year, but I think they have some difficulties in terms of going live this year. So it will be early next year, along with Hong Kong. and what we are seeing in India, China, and Indonesia, I think it has delayed. So again, there is uncertainty in terms of the regulatory implementation and timelines. So what we are seeing is that there is an uncertainty because of persistent regulatory delays in FRTB, and the interest of the banks is losing in terms of implementing FRTB in that sense.
That's a problem, isn't it? We had that same problem, I think, here in Europe, where everybody was ready, and then it was postponed and postponed, and everybody got off doing something else, and then it comes fast. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. May we see those poll results, please? And Cheryl, would you like to comment on them? Ah,
Wow.
yeah, they're doing well.
It's actually very surprising to see such a fat tail distribution in the result. Fair amount, little to do. Well, interested to know actually, is that referring to the whole implementation for SA, including the reporting side of things? I guess we...
On a generalist basis, I would say so, yeah.
Yeah. From what we've been talking to clients, I think definitely we've seen much more progress than like a couple of years ago when we all had a bit of lockdowns and all that. This year, actually since last year, we have seen more and more conversations started to turning the attention to the IMA conversation. Obviously, there are differences in banks, their approach, right? Some are only looking at applying IMA to a couple of key asset classes. Some are aiming for a full-on IMA. And we actually expect to see more banks starting the cost-benefit analysis of applying IMA as well. So the internal model approach.
Okay. So still stuff to do. So let me come to Fausto and tell me, why are there differences in FRTB implementation deadlines, and what particular issues are there in different APAC jurisdictions? So why this slightly odd, well, not odd, but disjointed timeline, and what are the different issues?
Thank you. I think that Xiao and Vishal have set very well the scene in terms of what's happening in APAC. And I would add to that, first of all, that recently China, in February 2023, China published the consultation paper with a proposed go-live date of January 2024. And similarly, Japan is expected to go live in 2024 as well. So overall, what we are seeing is a kind of fragmentation of the deadlines, right, which is causing a level playing field concern. So why this is happening? I think that here there is an overall uncertainty about FRTB, whether it is going to be implemented, and what are the final rules that we are going to see. So this kind of fragmentation of deadlines, is causing this level playing field concerns. And the thing is that no jurisdiction wants to go live first, because if a jurisdiction will go live first, they will put some competitive disadvantage on the local banks. So clearly, if a local bank goes live first, then other jurisdictions, this will be an issue. So, what are the issues that we are seeing due to this situation? So we are seeing uncertainty because banks, most of the banks are actually waiting for the final rules published in their jurisdictions. And we are seeing also situations on which there may be fragmentation also in the interpretation of the rules. For example, China, in the consultation paper that China published in February this year, they are basically putting a little bit, of an approach which is more conservative. For example, they are saying that, the PLA and the backtesting must be executed with a much higher frequency on a monthly and daily basis, respectively, whereby the BCBS is basically talking about quarterly. They are saying that they want to have a more conservative approach to risk management, which means that in particular, the probabilities of default floor is higher than the BCBS, meaning that the banks need to hold in China more capital against losses. So all this situation, about fragmentation of rules and fragmentation of deadlines is clearly causing, concerns on level playing fields, which clearly is not ideal from an overall, picture of implementation in APAC, and not only in APAC, I would say.
Okay. Gail, what would you add there? And as a practitioner, what are the issues for you in the different timelines and different issues in different jurisdictions?
Indeed, as we've seen, slightly different advancement in the finalization the rule, mainly between the US, the European region, and the Asia region. I think one of the key challenge, I don't think it's an issue, one of the key challenge which is emerging now is really the localization of this of the rules that are now well done, at least for the final Basel level rules. Those are transposed into local jurisdiction, and that's where there is some slight variation that occurs. And I think those they require, especially for banks that have a global presence, that have global trading book, to make sure that their implementation is a global implementation that cater for this slight different variation. For example, the specific risk weight for the FX delta in Hong Kong for Hong Kong dollar. There is a similar one in Europe, for example, for the single mechanism currency like Danish kroner. Those they require to have the ability to have different set of parameters feeding your calculation. There is another layer which is the regulatory clarification that comes from the regulator, for example, through the EBA FAQ. And each regulator have a similar aspect. They require some transparency, some implementation of those, and there is some slight variation from one jurisdiction to another. So this requires some time to customize the core engine calculation, or to customize your upstream feed of country, sector, rating, and the logic, the waterfall logic to feed your core calculation. For example, for FRTB SA. For IMA, the level of interpretation is even wider there. So roughly, I think the high level. The implementation deadline, I would say, are not so coming from a design which was quite some time ago. I think the deadline are not so different. So Japan is slightly earlier, not so much earlier than the other jurisdiction. Everyone is basically converging around 2025. So I think that's why I would take the poll result. I would interpret the poll result as that everyone has already integrated. If you want me to say it that way, the market has is already pricing that this will be around 2025, slightly earlier, slightly later. That's why everyone has already done the key part of the implementation of the FRTB, I think.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And bring it in, Vishal. What can we learn about FRTB implementation from other regions when we're looking at APAC?
Well, that's an interesting question, because if you look at it, I think the UK banks hold around 14% of their RWA market risk, whereas rest of the banks are much below than that. So in my view, I think the market risk or the market RWAs does not have a big impact in terms of the capital requirements per se for the banks per se. But I think it's the implementation fatigue for FRTB that basically created the problem. The other part of the problem is that banks are competing with each other on very thin margins, and therefore even if it is 14% or 12% of the RWA, it is a significant number that comes into play. So there was a lot of analysis trade-off analysis between going IMA approach or going for a standardized approach or going for a hybrid approach. So if you look at it, I think all the three major regions, if I were to say Europe, Asia, and America in that sense, most of the American banks started late in terms of looking at the trade-off analysis, but the European banks and especially the Singaporean banks and the Hong Kong banks, etc., were looking at FRTB since 2013, 2014 onwards.
Okay.
So yeah, so in that sense, I would say that at the deployment, I would say Asia and Europe would be ahead of the US. But the US has a technical advantage, so obviously they can come up on the curve very fast because most of them were on POAR models and so on and so forth. So it's easier for transition for them.
Okay, thank you. Fausto, what would you add to that? You've seen implementation in Europe. Are there things that can be implemented in APAC to make it a bit of a smoother journey?
Yeah, what we are seeing overall is that Europe, I would say that is the only jurisdiction that basically put together the overall legislation package for FRTB, the final rules, and they have a clear deadline, which is January 2020. 2025. Although I have to say that in the legislation package for FRTB in Europe, they put a particular clause that says that if they see some kind of delay in other jurisdiction, they have the power, they have the authority clearly to further delay of 2 years the entry in force of FRTB, which is again, this is a kind of level playing field, let's say, close. However, in terms of our experience with Europe, I wouldn't talk about US because US we still don't see the rules, and basically there is no so much activity besides the global banks. But in Europe in particular, they've started to work on FRTB since last year. Very, I would say that the reporting on the SA, the reporting requirements went live on 2021, and now in 2022, banks have started also to work on IMA. So currently, the banks in Europe have a submission deadline for the IMA desks, which is June this year. This means that by June this year, they have to submit the overall package for the IMA, explaining which are the desks that will go to IMA and all the necessary details for allowing the regulator to plan the necessary due diligence over the next 18 months. In terms of challenges that we are seeing today in Europe, things that perhaps even in APAC are similar challenges. We are seeing, first of all, that it is very tough to pass the eligibility criteria for IMA. So the PLA requirements in particular are quite difficult to pass. And there is also an issue in terms of trying the right balance between for the risk factor definition between the PLA, the profit and loss attribution test, and the RFET. Because if you go for more granularity at risk factor level, this will be good for PLA for the PLA, but basically not for the RFET, and the other way around, will cause issues to the PLA. So that's finding the right granularity has been an issue that has been reported from many banks. The other challenge that we are seeing in Europe is that the RFET requires a lot of work, and basically it is a project in itself. And one of the things that we are seeing is that banks are spending a huge amount of time in Europe, basically for testing the data from multiple vendors, meaning that they have to run POCs, which typically can take months to be run and be concluded. Right. So finally, because of this situation, which means that IMA is much tougher than the previous regulatory regime, what we are seeing in Europe is that some of the banks which were on IMA in Basel 2.5, which were on IMA in the previous regulatory regime, now have decided basically to go to SA, fully to SA in the first wave of FRTB, and they will reassess IMA later in 2024, at the end of 2024, right? That's, the overall things that we are seeing in Europe.
Okay, that's great. And on those acronyms and everything else, let's run a quick audience poll this time and talk about which elements of FRTB are currently the most challenging at your organization. So again, you should be able to see that poll question to the right of your video. So do please vote. And while you vote, and please feel free to tick as many boxes as are appropriate to your organization, let me come back to APAC and ask Gail how he sees the remaining and toughest outstanding challenges of FRTB implementation.
So let me focus maybe on the standardized approach. I think the rules now are well known, well understood. Everyone had plenty of times, plenty of years to digest them. So I think the only the remaining part that will be there for standardized approach in terms of implementation would be to make sure that you have the right analytics layer for FRTB SA. So FRTB SA is a standardized approach method, meaning that it's compact and simple in terms of the concepts that are used there. So that the mathematical concept that it used they are simple, but this doesn't mean that the implementation is can be done in a very light way. And I think one of the remaining challenges is really to make sure that you have the right ability to drill down into standard approach numbers, that you have the right explainer of, for example, the day-to-day changes in the number, that you are able to slice and dice into standardized approach in an efficient way, and this requires some methodology/quant/IT developments to make sure that you're able to go from the top of the house number, down to the highest level of granularity. And since the FRTB is a standardized method, this is possible to do. This is whereas for some other metrics like expected shortfall, or for example for IMA, which has multi-layer, especially the NMRF charge, which is less crisp sensitive piece, slicing and dicing from the top of the number down to what drives which number is a bit more, is less straightforward. But for FRTBSA, through SBM, DRC, and IO, it's possible to do that. And I think that if you are able to really achieve this, you will have some clear explainer on your number. And I think the remaining challenge is really to have this light, efficient implementation. That's one other point is around I think the more generally the integration with the remaining of the Basel III package, because the Basel III package has been implemented in a quite a different timeline. SACCR was one of the first, which is live in all region, whereas some part came later, like for example the FRTB CVA, which has been finalized at Basel level a little later. So making sure that you are consistent across all the Basel package in terms of reference data. There are a lot of common reference data across SACCR, FRTB, CVA, and the other part of the credit-related Basel III. And making sure that those are consistent, those are aligned, is I think a remaining challenge for APAC, but also I think more globally.
Okay, thank you. And Xiao, building on that, what do you see when you're out in the market? Where are the remaining challenges for the people you're working with?
I think Gail has covered pretty much everything. And one thing I would probably add is the consistency across jurisdictions still be a challenge we've seen. We have seen like local modifications to some extent. In the US and EMEA, there are fewer jurisdictions to worry about, where in APAC you have like much more to manage. So a client say they have to like switch the calculation jurisdiction by jurisdiction, right? It's a lot of work just to say the word jurisdiction. So I can imagine the technology and the workflow overload. And also think about the US rule hasn't come out, the NPR hasn't yet published. This would add more complexity to any bank with like regulated entities in the US.
Okay, so still a lot to come and a lot to be thinking about. Excellent, thank you very much indeed. Maybe see those poll results on the challenges, and Fausto, would you like to comment on these? So yep, sourcing all the required data, and the data quality comes up top, and then the RFET. Selecting your model. What do you think, Fausto?
Yeah, it's not a surprise. What I'm seeing, in the outcome of this poll is not really a surprise. It is what we are hearing, from all the banks, and not only from APAC, but also from the rest of the banks in the world that are working on IMA. So first one, I think that the first two results are actually highlighting, the issue about basically RFET, which is, as I said, a project in itself. And the issue here is that basically, it's now clear that, basically banks have to buy data from vendors because internal trades are not sufficient. And the fact that they have to buy data and they have to basically integrate this data within their system, it's a challenge in itself, right? Because they have to, they have to work on taxonomies, they have to make sure that they have consistency in the data models, they have to make sure that they modernize their infrastructure and so on and so forth. So, I think that this is actually reflecting what we are hearing from other regions as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And Coming back more specifically to one element of FRTB, Xiao, please would you outline the challenges of achieving the internal model approach for compliance? It's a difficult one. And I think, as Fausto said, in Europe, it was the big ambition, but not necessarily the reality in the early days. So how do you see the IMA approach working?
Yeah, as the poll suggested, right, there's so many elements that's completely new to the existing framework, and the data being one of the largest challenges we've seen. And that's also the feedback we've heard in APAC as well. Nowadays, actually, banks feel they have a lot of data, but the fit for purpose is actually a core here. Think about the data you have, is that fit for the purpose, like what Fausto just mentioned, right? And I think also in terms of the history of the data, I think if the data had to go back all the way to 2007, sometimes it's a struggle for banks, even those large global banks as well. So data is definitely one of them. And technology, like the whole revamp of the framework, make the technology be very hard. So it sounded like everything on that list. If I were to tick, I would tick.
Okay, fine, thank you. And Fausto, where do you see the challenges around the internal model approach? You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, generally speaking, if a bank decides to go to internal model for some desks, because it is because they are expecting some savings in terms of capital requirements. That's the fundamental objective, right, that they are getting. However, the flip side of this is that, if a bank wants to go to internal model, they have to invest a lot of money. And they have to have very specialized skills, very specialized people, right? Because they require a lot of activity on market risk models and so on. And so forth. And what we are also seeing, and that's a challenge, is that in many cases, these benefits in terms of savings, in terms of capital requirements, are not always there, right? Sometimes what we are seeing, that some banks are not seeing the justification from a capital savings perspective to go to IMA, and that's why some of the banks that were on IMA previously now are basically in some way holding off and getting to SA first, and they will reassess IMA later. That's one of the biggest challenge. The other thing is about the difficulty, the real problem, the real issues about getting, let's say, IMA desks passing the eligibility criteria and passing the eligibility criteria consistently. We have had some feedback from some banks that the PLA and the back testing were not, how can I say, were not stable. In some period, in some quarter, they were working well, and in other quarter, they were actually working, they were not passing. And finally, I would mention, the RFET again. So as I said before, it's clear that banks that will go to IMA and will have to pass, they will have to manage this RFET test. They will have to take, source data from external vendors, because internal trades are not sufficient, and this is actually posing a lot of challenges, specifically because there are some of this data, some of the data that they on which they have exposure, some of the instruments, some of the trading positions for which they have exposure, which correspond, to products which are not liquid. For example, options that are long dated, or interest rate, trades which are long dated as well, or interest rate non-linear products which are, illiquid by nature. So, all in all, I would say that the key challenges that we have on the IMA, which we are not seeing only in APAC, are still there. And if I may, I would also mention the final thing, which is about the possibility that, rules, the FRTB rules can diverge. For example, we are seeing already an example of divergences for the RFET. The definition of committed quote, which basically the BCBS is defining in a way. So they are saying the BCBS rules basically say that a committed quote, for being eligible for the RFET, they must have, either a bid or an ask price. Whereby, if we see what Europe has come out, in their version of the rules, they are saying that a committed quote must have both a bid and an ask. So you can imagine that a bank that is present in multiple jurisdictions, how can the complexity that they will have when they have to manage different types of rules. That's just an example. That might be other examples in terms of divergences.
Okay, thank you, Fausto. And staying with you, that's a lot of challenges. We saw the challenges in the poll. How can banks approach these challenges, and what does these changes mean to the business? Because some people, as you say, with the IMA or the standard approach, it can make a difference.
Yeah, I think that first of all, it is critical that they plan very carefully the IMA and they start to work ahead. So they start to allocate enough resources and time to finalize the IMA business case, right? Because identifying the desks that will go to IMA, it's not a simple exercise. There are multiple factors that have to be taken into account, right? And the other thing, that in terms of best practices, I would say specifically for the RFET, which again, in my view, is one of the biggest challenges that we have on IMA. So first of all, they have to make sure that they basically schedule enough time for running POC with vendors, because this is an activity that can take, months. We have situations on which customers have started to work on, on the RFET since mid last year, and they are still working on it. Right, so it can take a big amount of money, of time and money. The other thing is to make sure that they think also strategically. So FRTB is an opportunity, in my view, for modernizing some data management infrastructure and getting basically some applications in some departments which were siloed. Getting more, let's say, infrastructure in place that can actually join up all the different applications and make sure that the data will flow consistently and in an easier way. And finally, I would say that in terms of best practices, I think that for the RFET, banks has to work on the data taxonomy to make sure that they can accommodate data from multiple internal and external sources. We are also seeing some of the banks that are working on RFET, that they basically are putting in place a machine learning tool, to discover basically those observations, those real-time observations that can add value to the RFET. So rather than doing this manually and trying to do a very complex and time-consuming exercise, they are automating some of the processes for assessing the data by using this machine learning technology.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Vishal, as a practitioner, how do you approach these challenges, and does it likely change the shape of the business in terms of the desks and so on?
Yeah, it does. I think if we approach this problem not as a regulatory problem, but as a problem for the business, I think the intention behind this regulation was, in effect, running a very efficient trading business. And the way I see it is basically this is our opportunity to organize desk and across jurisdiction, and as to what makes sense in terms of combining the various portfolios. So that basically becomes the thumb rule for applying IMA or standardized approach based on the portfolio that you're carrying. So if the portfolio has risky items, obviously IMA would be more appropriate. If the portfolio has vanilla products and so on and so forth, obviously standardized approach might work in the short term. Obviously, this all has to be monitored very closely. So I think that top-down strategy works very well in terms of organizing the desk in a proper way, because in most of the banks we have seen that the desk themselves have various products, and those were organized based on who is capable of doing what and so on and so forth. But now the capability takes a second, and what is the business to be run, I think, takes the first cut. Secondly, I think performance measurement becomes more real in this aspect, because the capital cost are assigned to the desk. It can incentivize people as well as disincentivize. So that those are the major challenges which HR will also have to look at it at some stage. So I'm not seeing this only as a data issue. The other part, which is important and equally pertinent, what Fasto said, is the data. I think the bank will have to look at the entire data strategy per se. How do we combine a desk which have different locations? So there might be a desk which might have different locations, and then how do you combine the desk from different locations into one desk? And if those jurisdictions have different regulations, then how do you account for that? So I think those are real business problems. This can be solved by aligning locations and jurisdictions closely, and having a much more global strategy rather than having a local strategy for this.
Okay, excellent. And staying with you, Vishal, what kinds of RegTech solutions and services are you finding useful here? Are you using the same old, or are you looking at some new stuff? You talk about the challenge, the possibility of changing things as you implement FRTB.
I can't tell you as to what RegTech solutions we are using, but I can give you a framework for that. Obviously, I think the biggest framework that we have is the transparency criteria in terms of as to how does the system enable transparency across desk, across locations, across products, and is it basically flexible enough to basically change static data and so on and so forth. So I think that's a critical part. The secondly is how capable is the engine in that sense, especially when it can take different observation dates, and then in fact we are looking at like storage capacity as well as a big part of it in terms of how long the data can be stored and without having much of an issue. Then again, the important part is traceability. And data traceability again plays a very important role. And if the system has some capabilities with regards to A, modeling capacity, B, data capture and data cleansing capacity, I think that allows for a much cleaner and much preferable system. If it has regulatory reports which can be inbuilt for various locations and various desks, and those cuts are available by different people, different locations, different desks, whether they pass the back testing or not pass the back testing, I think that will be really helpful.
Okay, thank you. And Xiao, coming to you with your experience, what sort of RegTech solutions and services can help here?
Sure, absolutely. I think no doubt FRTB is the biggest and most sophisticated market risk regulatory overhaul in the past 2 decades. Its implementation, as all the panelists has mentioned, has a huge demand across the board, right? From the IT infrastructure mentioned, data, and even the human resources, the technology and quant resources. We have seen clients using FRTB as a catalyst for the IT transformation. And so banks can adopt their infrastructure to optimize the performance and lower the total cost of ownership. Clients no longer actually looking their own data analytics. They will access the third-party information services also to do some benefit and cost analysis on that. To make a holistic solution. So for example, like what Fausto mentioned about the committed quote, right? Different jurisdiction may have different interpretation of that. A third-party vendor could potentially give that flexibility to the clients, and when they collect all the information, and there will be a specific, say, for example, metrics or indicator saying this is like one-sided, both-sided, or firm quotes or trade data, this kind of information. And like Vishal was talking about just now as well, about the data history, right? The data itself, I mean, it's potentially a task itself to store all the data and take the golden copy of the data. So here, like a third-party vendor could also come in and help.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So some internal, but some external help on some of the data, particularly some of the historical data. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's take a break here. I have some audience questions for you. So actually, I'm going to come back to you, Xiao, on the first one here. It says, FRTB is already a challenging regulation. Will it get more complex, or could its requirements be reduced? Either way, what could happen and what should firms have on their radar? I think it's still a look forward question. Is it going to be more difficult? Should people be investing more now? What do you think? Jacques, can you answer that one for us?
Yeah, sure. So the question is about will the FRTB solution become more
it becomes more difficult, or whether the regulator will pull back a bit. What do you think?
Well, this is a complex question, actually. I think the regulator definitely want to have a better framework and better risk management, tools to regulate all these banks. But on the other hand, that it would also need to make sense, right? Just for the sake of being more difficult, I don't think that's the aim of anyone. So I guess we just have to wait and see. And I think one thing it's important is to start early. And the benefit of that is for banks to have that direct engagement with the regulator and to have a more, clear direction or even some active dialogue with the regulator. That will be very helpful for the bank themselves as well as the regulators.
Okay. Vishal, how do you see this going? Harder?
Yeah.
Easier?
So in essence, I think this regulation was designed, in my view, is to basically run an efficient and risk-free trading business with all the bells and whistles in it. Now, if we take that as a principle, I think it's already at its peak. It's already a very challenging regulation, and it cannot get more complex. But if it gets more complex also, I think it's the right time to basically start negotiating with the regulators, or maybe there is an intention to basically simplify the business. So those are the two messages I can look at. I think from here, if there is any complexity, I think it's time to talk to them.
Okay, fine. Fausto, what would you add?
Yeah, what I would add is that the industry is actually expecting that specifically for IMA, the regulators will at the end, soften in some way requirements, right? But if I see what's happening in those jurisdictions that have actually, published rules, again, Europe is one of them, but even China now that they've issued this consultation paper, a couple of months ago. If I stay on China in particular, and the same is more or less in Europe, I see that actually it is the other way around, because I see a little bit of more conservative approach than the BCBS, meaning that the regulation in China might become tougher than the BCBS. As an example, basically we are seeing in the consultation paper that the China regulator is asking banks first of all to run the PLA on a monthly basis rather than on a quarterly basis, and they are asking to run the back testing on a daily basis rather than on a quarterly basis, right? Which is clearly, something that is a big difference. And the other thing is about, what we are seeing in the China rules is a little bit of more conservative approach, because they are basically asking banks to hold more capitals for certain situations, specifically, those addressing the probabilities of default, meaning that, this will imply that the overall economy in China will become, tougher, because if they have to have more conservative capital requirements, basically, whoever is going to ask for, borrowing for money or getting, let's say, some mortgage will be impacted in the overall economy. So what I'm seeing overall is that, we're going to the other way around. Rather than softening, we are actually, getting more complexity.
Okay, so if you have any regulators on the webinar, you'll be called up to explain it soon. Yeah, excellent. Okay, something we've touched on, and can I come to you on this one, Gail? We've touched on it quite a bit, but can you bring this one together? The question is, our organization is global. How can we implement FRTB across this footprint?
So for global implementation, which is happening as the rule are becoming live as either reporting requirement or binding requirement, I think the key is around the implementation, the modularity and the flexibility for a standardized approach. You need to have the ability to really from a core calculation, which is about the same in all jurisdictions for sensitivity-based method, DRC and RIO, you need to be able to plug into those different set of parameters, correlation, risk weights, and also you need to have the ability to bifurcate your upstream feed in case, for example, local regulators allow for some rating agency to be used, but not for others, or whether they have a different definition of large cap versus small cap, which is already the case. Is $2 billion originally in the Basel text, is €2 billion in the CR2 version. So we expect this to happen. Each regulator use their own domestic currency. So you need to have something which is quite modular, both in terms of core engine and upstream feed to to that. I think that's the challenge for globalization. Then for IMA, since IMA has different type of clarification and requirement from each local regulators, this is a very different beast. This is a very different beast. Globalization in the context of IMA is way more tricky to address. But for ISA, that's definitely something that is possible. You just need to have some form of right infrastructure and methodology behind it.
Okay, anybody want to add anything on that one? Okay, let's press on. Okay, technical question. Vishal, you may be able to help us with this one. How can front and back office alignment best be ensured in an environment of legacy systems and data silos?
I think FRTB implementation per se actually requires 3 to 4 years of implementation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reasons why the regulators have been dangling and not dangling, I would say the right word is pushing the deadline away is also they look at the preparedness of the players as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that all the banks and most of the banks in the region have gone through some sort of a data transition or data transformation. Either they are preparing a data warehouse, or are they preparing some sort of a data strategy? And that sort of data strategy, either to help them in their digital transformation or as part of their day-to-day running of business, has become central to most of the banks in the region in APAC as well. And that has allowed for alignment between front office and back office from a data standpoint. But as far as the objectives and culture is concerned, I think there is still a lot of work that needs to happen. And probably I think that sort of work will happen as a result of that this regulation cannot be treated like a capital saving exercise or capital accretion exercise. It has to be treated like a business exercise and seeing that the intention of the regulator is to transform the business at the end of the day. And
Okay.
so that alignment will come as part of that strategy rather than taking it as a technical exercise.
Okay. This one sort of follows this last question, and let me come back to Xiao, if I may. FRTB means sourcing more data. This is expensive. Can the cost of the data be justified for any other forms of compliance? I think we've heard throughout the webinar that, yep, this could be part of a data transformation, which makes the data more valuable in terms of a larger process. Can the data be reused and the expense slightly reduced?
Well, in this business, I have to say data is expensive because the cost from getting the data is expensive, and technology to transform the data, normalize the data is also expensive. But I do agree the whole data transformation is something that we've seen more and more banks start to look at, especially in the past. What we see is we have like clients demand here and there some kind of data set. Now we see more and more clients look at from enterprise level and the front to back office usage, and then all the data can be, there's a consistency there. There is also a cost saving there as well. So I definitely I think going forward, probably the data transformation and the whole enterprise data would be the way to go.
Okay, Fausto, a view from you?
Yeah, I would echo what Xiao said for sure, and I would add that perhaps a justification of the cost of the data. And when I say the data, I mean in particular the data that banks have to buy specifically for the RFT, which is trade data. So building, let's say, a consistent and huge repository of trade data can also be relevant for other use cases besides FRTB. So, for example, liquidity monitoring. So I would say that buying data, it is true that it is costly because the data specifically for this use case are quite costly. But it is also true that that data can be perhaps leveraged for other use cases as well, which clearly can reduce the impact of the
Okay.
investment.
Yeah, and I think like Foster was saying, right? Another example could be the trade data is the transparency data that can also be re-leveraged repurposed by the independent valuation team. And what they will now be looking at is, instead of looking at the consensus data, the regulator saying, look, I need some hard evidence, therefore I want transaction data, or data that can support this fair value hierarchy assessment that the banks are doing.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you very much indeed. And let's leave our audience questions there. So thank you for your questions, and thank you to our speakers for their answers. And coming back to my questions, Gail, please would you outline the steps that banks should be taking now, and whether you think there's going to be any lenience about when they get there?
I think the deadlines, they are known, so there is no expectation that the timeline will change. They are well defined. They've been communicated. So it's for example, April 2024 for Japan, for the significantly large banks. This is known, and in most jurisdictions, this timeline is really known. So I don't think many banks would expect any material change in the timeline, even if jurisdiction like the UK, where the timelines aren't fully finalized. From the consultation paper, it's clear what it is. So I think those timelines globally, they are known, except from the US. So there is nothing else to expect there. But I think that even more than where is the finish line, which I think is clear. What matters is, how do you pass the finish line? You can pass the finish line being exhausted and grumpy, or you can pass the finish line being fresh and smiling. And what we want is to pass the finish line fresh and smiling. And to do that, you need to start earlier, which is what Chan was saying. You need to start early, so that you don't have to run the sprint, but you can run a semi-marathon. And then you have time to build up enough data and see how the rules work day in and day out. I think a long parallel run is something which is very informative, from implementation, for technology, for risk manager, for the business. And this is the key part where everyone should be right now. In this parallel run, looking at the numbers, adjusting for any final tweak in the implementation. And one layer of that is really that people should be running numerical validation pretty much on an ongoing basis during this long run. Numerical validation and model implementation, to me, they are not just a one-off. It's not just you develop and you deliver. It should be ongoingly tested and numerically tested, which is the direction of travel that we see with daily back testing that Fausto was mentioning, or weekly RNIV. The direction of travel is that you should be running ongoing performance, ongoing check on your model. And for this, you need to start early.
Okay, that's great. Let me move on. Let's run our final poll. We won't comment on this one because we are running out of time, but to Gail's point of view of smiling across the path when you pass the line, what are, or would you expect to be, the benefits of getting FRTB right? So please do feel vote on that. And let me come to Xiao to talk about how she sees the benefits here.
Actually, I think the benefit, it would definitely come from potentially the capital saving, for one. We have seen analysis saying that with the IMA, like more, I guess the portfolio more sophisticated, they will definitely benefit more. And on top of that, I think it's the importance, the introduction of the expected shortfall give banks like a better risk viewpoint, right? Professor John Ho made this argument like long back, like 2006. And the lastly is that one of the main theme of the recent regulatory reform is deleverage, which means increase the cost of trading. So getting it right, I think, gives bank a competitive edge, right? To improve with the improved transparency on the best route to trade, who to trade with. This definitely very, 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 very beneficial for the bank themselves.
Okay, could we just see the results? We won't comment on them, but so that everybody can see what people out there are thinking. Let's see the poll results, if we may. There you go. Was along the lines of what Xiao was saying about capital, improve risk management. Excellent. Thank you for voting on that one. And coming to our final question, I'd like to ask all the speakers to offer some advice to practitioners working on FRTB implementation. Vishal, please would you start here?
Yeah, sure. I think optimization of capital definitely is one of the larger benefit, but from a practitioner standpoint, I would suggest look at the global strategy of the business per se. And this is one of the better times to do that. Obviously, most of the banks would have done their review of that business. So definitely look at it as a business exercise. Data strategy, very important. And third is the alignment between front office and middle office and validation and audit as well.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Gail, what advice would you give?
So in addition to the one I was mentioning, which is to do a long parallel run so that everyone from front to end in the bank has time to get familiar and understand the new rules and the dynamic of them, how the capital works, what drives them up, what drives it up, what drives it down, how does it react to a large position in the trading book, how does it react to hedges. The other one is around this ongoing numerical validation that to me needs to happen quite regularly, as we see already happening as an industry initiative driven by ISDA. ISDA is running already unit testing and hypothetical portfolio exercise to test for everyone to test the FRTB number. This has been ongoing for a few years now, more centered on Europe, but I think this will happen globally, and everyone will need to unit test their FRTB implementation very regularly. Also, we can expect that the calibration of the FRTB might change as market change. Risk weights might have to change depending on what happens in the market. So this might require some retesting of the FRTB. So you need to have this capacity to do ongoing numerical testing, and for this you need the help of the machine. And the final one is really to make sure that you pick up the right model. We can't underestimate the operating cost, the operating burden of picking up a capital calculation which is not right for your business. As FRTB programs closes in and the budget is closed, then you are left with really running those models, making them lives. And we know that especially for IMA, the operating costs are very large because you need to run some tests and gather data really continuously at high. You need big pipes, so you need big budget. That's quite a big operation burden. So you need to make sure you pick up the model which is fit for the business.
Okay, great. Fausto, your advice, please.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, for those jurisdictions that will go live in 2024, I'm sure that, and we are seeing also in the polls that all the banks that are on those jurisdictions are actually working quite hard for meeting those deadlines. Whereby for the other jurisdictions, right, which are not yet, for which the live data is not yet been announced, and my advice is that they start to work now. First of all, focusing on the SA, because for sure most of the banks in the region will go to SA. And for those that will go to IMA, let's try. They should start to build the business case on IMA and make sure that they prepare in advance. The second advice is about thinking strategically, which means that FRTB is an opportunity for modernizing your data management infrastructure, modernizing your internal processes, and basically get the benefit of all these investments for other use cases as well, not necessarily only for FRTB. And the final advice is about for the IMA banks. They have to make sure that they finalize the data sourcing strategy and how do they want to work with vendors very, very soon, because that's one of the key, let's say, more costly and time-consuming aspects.
Okay, some final words from you, Xiao.
It has all my panelists have said all the good stuff. I guess I just lighten the mood a bit because we're stepping to the long weekend in Hong Kong. So I think stay connected because this is a small community, right? The ecosystem. We wanted to, we will be able to exchange some ideas. And the other one is to leverage external solutions and services. It's definitely helpful nowadays. Bank probably can't really run, especially the IMA, on their own. The last thing would be start early, right? Early bird catch the worm. And that's all from me.
Thank you very much indeed, Xiao, and thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience. Thank you too to ICE and Refinitiv and LSEG Business for sponsoring today's webinar. Finally, before we close, just a couple of items that A-Team Group has coming up. And they are a webinar on the 13th of June on how to optimize and streamline regulatory reporting using outsourced and managed services. Or please join our 11th of July webinar on multi-cloud environments. And you can also register for our 5th of October RegTech Summit in London. Seems like a long way away, but it'll suddenly be upon us, I feel sure. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Xiao, Fausto, Gail, and Michelle. And thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please do complete our feedback form as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime,